your New Year's resolutions? Have you made any New Year's resolutions? You know, what I find is that when I make New Year's resolutions, they last about 3 days. Maybe if I'm really dedicated, they'll last a week. Or once in a while, I'll come up with something that really does make a difference. But when we make promises to ourselves, like, I'm going to get up as soon as that alarm rings. Right. Or we make whatever other promises we make as our New Year's resolutions. Well, I don't think there's anything that reminds us more that we can do nothing in our own strength. We can only do good things. We can only change habits. We can only have our life changed when Christ strengthens us. This is what we focus on this New Year's Day, and this is what our scriptures have to say to us today. There is, in our passage in Galatians, where we read beginning with verse 4, the fullness of time, the secret there, we received adoption. Adoption. What is so significant about adoption? Well, if we think about the Old Testament, up until this time, people were given rules. The law of Moses, the 10 Commandments. And I do want to be sure to remind you that the 11th commandment about loving your neighbor, that's also in the Old Testament. But the people were given rules to live by. Rules that would differentiate the Israel nation from other nations around them. Rules that said, we are the people of God. And then there's a transition. This beautiful transition that is stated so clearly in the book of Galatians, where it says that we are adopted. Those who were under the law, those who were living by the 10 Commandments, those who were trying to be good enough to have God's grace and mercy, we are now adopted as children. You are children. God has sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. And Abba is that word that really means something more than father. Father being a very formal word, Abba is a very informal word, more like Papa or Daddy, that truly signifies we are children of God. What a promise we have. Children of the promise. So we can do nothing in our own strength, but we can do all things in Christ who strengthens us. And we no longer live under the law, having to keep all the rules. Not that we're going to run out and break them. But it's a different attitude, because now we are children of God. Now, we don't keep the rules because somebody told us we had to. Now we keep the rules because we love God, and we're sharing God's love with the world, and we're sharing our joy that we are God's people. A whole change of attitude. Now maybe that's why we don't do a very good job of keeping our New Year's resolutions. Maybe we just don't see the transition. There's nothing as important as this transition from being the servants of God to being the slaves to being the children of God. What a transition. Simeon saw it. This is a passage that I typically read at the end of a funeral service. The one that says, Master, now you are dismissing your servant in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people, Israel. My eyes have seen your salvation. And how do we see God's salvation? By letting God into our hearts and carrying that presence of God with us in every moment of our life. I think some people must have gotten that message this Christmas season. Because at least on 3 different occasions, almost exactly the same words came out of people's mouths in our conversation. And the words were to the effect of, sometimes I get myself so wrapped up in worry, and then I find myself saying, why do I do that? Life isn't in my hands anyway. There's a change of attitude, recognizing that everything is in God's hands. When we are willing to let go, when we are willing to live with prayer, when we're willing to celebrate God's presence in our hearts, that's when we can say together with Simeon, my eyes have seen your salvation. Maybe it's when we're truly aware and living in God's salvation, the knowledge of God's salvation every day, that then 2 things. Our New Year's resolution becomes one of significance, and we are more and more able to keep it because we know without a doubt that we are God's children and God is always with us. I use that alarm clock one because many, many, many people through the years have told me that was their New Year's resolution. They weren't going to sleep in anymore. They weren't going to hit the snooze button as many times. We had an interesting time in our family. When the youngest was in high school, or maybe he was in 8th grade, whatever, but I think he was a freshman in high school. And he had an older sister and brother were living in the house too, not to mention the parents. Well, one night at a family discussion over the dinner table, people brought up the fact that he never got up when his alarm went off. He kept hitting the snooze button. He would hit that snooze button for an hour. He would set the alarm early so he could set the snooze button for an hour. And of course it woke up everyone else in the family. And he would get up on time. And the brother and sister, now, parents, we had it easy. We were on the 1st floor. But brother and sister were on the 2nd floor where he was. And they're like, why do you do this? Well, we kind of took up with the older siblings and we said, yeah, why are you doing this? It's going to be annoying. He said, well, you know what? He said, I don't run around, I don't drink, I don't do drugs, I don't do any of the things that some of my acquaintances in school do. So, aren't you happy that I have found a peaceful way to just be myself on one thing? And we kind of have to listen to the wisdom of that and say, yeah, maybe it's not so bad after all. Everything's on a relative scale. Everything's on a relative scale. And if we're going to limit our resolutions to alarm clocks, getting places on time, doing certain things that we've neglected, how much more if, like here, my eyes have seen your salvation, that we start truly living God's love. If everywhere we go, we are aware of other people. I can't tell you how many management books or salesmanship books or business books I have read that say how to make yourself successful. And one of the very first steps is always be interested in other people. Be interested in other people. Be genuinely interested in other people. Listen to them. Find out what's going on in their lives. Greet them by name. Share the love of the Lord would be my translation of all those good bits of advice. Share God's love. My eyes have seen your salvation, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for the glory to your people, Israel. When we make resolutions that show us how we're going to do that help us do that, those are the resolutions that will have double benefit. They'll benefit those around us, and they'll help us to grow in faith. So let's make some resolutions. You know, we can make little resolutions, like we can look here in our insert in our bulletin, and there are daily lectionary readings. I've had people ask where the lectionary readings are, and some Sundays for space we've left them out. I've had other people say, with regard to lectionary readings, there are. I never noticed. But there are. Just one of the little ways that we are given encouragement every day to start growing in faith. The lectionary readings for every day. And the lectionary readings for the Sunday worship are printed in your bulletin. That is, the passages are identified in your bulletin. You can go home and reread them. Think on them, ponder them, see what message is in there for you. This is a new year. I challenge you to make a New Year's resolution. And I challenge you to make a New Year's resolution that will help you grow in faith and in your ability to share your faith. In Christ's name, amen.